Hi everyone, how are you? So in this little video I want to talk about the course content, about what we'll be doing and why we're taking the approach that we're taking. I should note that I'm recording this right after the little welcoming video that I did, and I should further note that it is really cold this morning. Again, there's still ice outside. I have a little electric heater here, and it's only 400 watts, and I don't turn it on until, well, I'm looking straight across at my house, and there's a little solar array on the roof. And I wait till the solar is actually producing to turn the electric heater on, which it is. And I have a little app so I can see exactly how much electricity is being produced. Incidentally, regarding that, and maybe it's a good way to start this actually, I'm a big fan, as you may imagine, in technological solutions to the climate crisis, like solar panels. And they have become remarkably efficient and cost effective in the recent, well, really the last decade or so. So that array on the house cost us, after a government rebate, $5,900, under $6,000. You might say, well, that's a lot of money. And it is. It's a lot of money. But on the other hand, we were paying about $100 a month in the electric bill, and that array was put on 3.5 years ago. So if you do the math there, that will pay for itself within 5 years. In fact, we just have 1.5 years to go. And that array has a 25-year guarantee. And in fact, solar panels like that, which are single crystal panels, they've been in operation since the 1950s and 60s in places, and they're working just fine. They lose a little efficiency over time, so we might have to put like an extra panel in. But yeah, so it's a good start, because technology is something that's important. And well, a lot of times people think it's so important that they don't think of other things. And this is very apparent to me as far as what the general public thinks, because whenever I go give public talks, people are often excited that they're going to hear about the climate crisis from a UCSB professor, and then they find out that I'm an English professor, and their basic response is confusion as to why. Maybe confusion isn't even it. It's sometimes they're crestfallen and disappointed that, they're not getting a real specialist in the climate crisis, a scientist, or even better, like a technology person, like Elon Musk or something. Wouldn't that be cool? Yeah, well, sorry. But this does underscore. By the way, if you hear something going on outside, that's my dog, who has seen a squirrel, and she's running around looking at the squirrel. Sorry, this is the reality, I guess, of having lectures during COVID. You're sort of, yes, I know, she looks very upset. But anyhow, technology is great. The fact that I have solar cells should make very clear that I endorse it. However, technology is not going to sufficiently solve this problem. So I want to just talk briefly about 4 ways that we can approach the climate crisis. And the course website, the landing page, which I'm requiring you to read, goes into this in more detail. But let me just sort of basically frame it so do you know kind of what we're doing in this class. Technology is great, but let's talk about Elon Musk and electric cars for a moment. If we think that we can just go ahead and live our lives the way we did and do everything in the same way, the hope might be the technology will allow us to do that. And a Tesla would be an example of technology stepping in. You can, if you've been driving around your 5,000-pound SUV, and if you're a typical American, 3 out of 4 cars on the road just have one person in it. Well, no worries. If you can afford it, you can go buy a 5,000-pound Tesla and drive it around and feel that, that you've resolved the problem environmentally. That's not going to resolve the problem. The reason is there are already over 1 billion cars on the planet. We're approaching a global population of 8 billion people pretty soon. And as a consequence, by the end of the next decade, or sometime during the next decade, the 2030s, if everything continues the way it's going, there'll be 2 billion cars on the planet. People like cars, and we've exported this like to the rest of the world. We're the international leader, by the way. We have more cars per capita than we have licensed drivers in the U.S. The problem is, and I have a whole lecture on this, which you'll be watching, is that there's no way that we can sustain even the number of cars we have now, let alone, 2 billion cars on the planet, even aside from how they're propelled, whether they're gas, diesel, electric, or whatever, the sheer cost in terms of emissions of making cars makes that impossible. So I'll show you when we run the numbers. If you buy a car every 11 years, which is what most people do, and never drive that car, knowing what we know now about what our individual emissions have to be to meet the goals of the Paris Accord, which was signed in COP21, knowing that if you buy a car every 11 years and never drive it, you will have blown your entire carbon budget for your lifetime and have nothing left for anything else like eating or clothing or a home or something. So it's not going to work. Again, technology is good. Solar cells are good. But we have to think of other ways of approaching this rather than just the hope that technology will solve the problem. So this course will make a nod to technology here and again, but I am coming at this from the perspective of humanities. I'm a cultural historian. What I do is I look at cultures and try to understand how cultures work, how they came into being, what they represent, and just what's going on with them. And if we approach this not as a technological problem entirely, but as a cultural problem, then we can solve this in ways that technology never could. So, for example, in terms of transportation, there is a way of using the equivalent of 4 gallons of gasoline to travel across this continent. In other words, to go from LA to New York on 4 gallons of gasoline, the equivalent. Just to put that in perspective, depending on the kind of vehicle you had, if I drove from where I am here down to Oxnard or Camarillo, which are right down the coast and back again, if I had an SUV, I'd probably burn 4 gallons of gasoline. So technologically, it's possible to do something extraordinary, which is cross the country like that. How is it possible? Is it some sort of new amazing Hyperloop technology or something that we keep hearing about? It's not. It's been around for well over 100 years. It's high-speed rail. It's trains. Trains are much more efficient, 30 to 40 times more efficient than a car carrying a single person. It gets even better because if we build more high-speed rail that's powered by electricity, we can use renewables the entire way. Fossil fuels wouldn't be involved at all. And similarly, traveling by something like bus is 14 times more efficient than a car. You need these kind of efficiency levels to reach the goals that we need. And one of the best ways of getting around, which is how I commute to UCSB and back. And in fact, it's a 20-mile round trip, 10 miles to and 10 miles back to UCSB from my house. But I have a bike to do it. It's actually an electric assist bike. It's a pedelec. And in terms of resources, by the way, you can build 100 of those, including 100 battery packs for those, with the same resources it would take to make one Tesla. So you can see the economy of that in terms of emissions and everything else right away. You might say that's really impractical, and again, I have a whole lecture on this, but, look at a place like Copenhagen. Nearly 2 out of 3 people in Copenhagen commute or go to school by bike. And you might say, well, yeah, but the U.S. is cold and rainy and all. Yeah, Copenhagen is further north than any of the 48 states in the continental 48 states. And in fact, it is further north than in latitude than the capital of Alaska, Juneau. So it's quite practical to do it, and people do it all the time. But to do these things, to decide to take mass transit or a bike, it's not a technological thing, it's a cultural change. So we're going to be looking at those sort of cultural changes and what they involve and how they work. But something needs to be said about that, because you might get the impression then that this class is going to be entirely about making personal changes, deciding to take a bike, take a bus. Personal changes are very important. We're going to talk about them in a number of different ways and different scenarios. They're absolutely important, but they need to be put in perspective. So let me give an example, and that is methane emissions. Methane, as you may know, is a greenhouse gas, and it's far worse, generally speaking, than CO2, which is the principal greenhouse gas, which most people know about. How much worse? It depends on how you calculate its life in the atmosphere. but somewhere between, 20 or 30 times worse. So it's a problem. Well, there's good news. If you haven't gotten the memo, you'll get it when you watch Cowspiracy or the documentary Wasted in class, and that is 28% of all U.S. green methane emissions come from basically the beef industry. If we eliminated beef, we could eliminate almost a third of all methane being emitted. So, in terms of personal change, switching to a largely plant-based diet, which we'll talk about, is an absolutely great idea. But there are problems here. First, well, you may do it, your friends may do it, a lot of us in California may do it, but as far as the rest of the country, the rest of the world going to a plant-based diet, people may not voluntarily do this in large numbers. So how much of that 28% can you reduce? I'm not sure. If you look at people now, currently the number of vegans, percentage-wise in the U.S., very tiny, a few percent, even vegetarian, not so much. So it's a formidable challenge to reduce that 28% by way of this. Don't get me wrong. I absolutely think it has to work, and I think that, we should be doing it. In fact, I will talk a little bit about my personal life, because up until a couple of years ago, I was a hardcore vegan for 5 years, and I know it's absolutely possible, and in fact very pleasant. And I'll talk about why I'm still very much like a vegan, but I'm not super hardcore about it anymore. I do wear my leather boots, and I don't feel too bad about it. But we'll talk about that. So then here's the problem. Personal change, to get everyone to do it, that's a hard thing. And even so, it's a big challenge. But let's go back to methane again. 28%, coincidentally, another 28% of methane comes from fracking, which is the long term is hydraulic fracturing, which is a technique to extract oil and natural gas from the earth. People often think of fracking in terms of natural gas, which is true. Most fracked fossil fuels in the U.S. are natural gas, but oil is fracked as well. In fact, in California, we frack more for petroleum oil than we do natural gas. And we'll get into this in detail, but fracking is just a process where you inject liquids into the ground under pressure to fracture, hence fracking, the underground rocks to release the oil or natural gas trapped there, and then you can extract it. It's very effective. It's been around for like 20 years, and as a consequence, the U.S. is like is not like the leading fossil fuel producer on the planet because of it. The problem is, an unfortunate byproduct, an unavoidable byproduct of fracking, is that it releases methane into the atmosphere. And again, 28% of the methane in the atmosphere, 28% of methane emissions in the U.S. are coming from fracking. The same amount as beef, just a coincidence. But how do you address fracking as a personal issue? I mean, you can say you'll reduce the amount of fossil fuels you'll consume, but you also need alternatives to them, like good mass transit and things, and that's not something you can do personally. And besides, how do you hold responsible an entire industry personally? You really can't. But two other things that we're going to look at this term. So we've done 2 of the 4 here. So one is technology, important, but not really the focus of this course. 2, personal action, which is fine. But here's 3 and 4. 3 is activism. How does that work? Well, if you're an activist, you identify a problem and you take action on it. You try to get everyone aware of it, and you try to make it so that action is done. So a few years ago, the actor Mark Ruffalo contacted me and a number of UCSB professors. He had made a film about fracking in California and appealed to Jerry Brown, who was our governor, to outlaw fracking, which even though Brown was a good environmental governor in many respects, he did not do that. But it's interesting because here's a guy, an actor, Mark Ruffalo, who really felt strongly about it and decided to roll up his sleeves, become an activist, try to make as many people aware of the situation as possible so that, action would be taken. You can see why I consider myself an activist too, because in posting all this material online and all, I'm trying to make as many people aware of the problem as well. If you succeed in doing that, if an activist succeeds in doing it, and enough people become aware of it and frustrated over it, then you have the number 4 thing. So we've had technology, we have personal action, we have activism. Well, the number 4 thing I can tell you that people often come up to me and ask me, what's the number 1 thing that they could do to help mitigate the climate crisis, right? So they realize I probably have a lot of things. In fact, on that landing page, you're going to see 20 things that you can do. But what is the number 1 thing? And it's a very easy answer and hopefully a very comforting answer to people, because the number 1 thing you can do is super easy and only takes an hour or 2 a year. Doesn't require major lifestyle changes or anything of the sort. All you have to do is vote. Voting is absolutely the number 1 thing that you can do. Why? Well, in the last presidential election, which just passed, leading up to it in the primaries, we had a number of candidates like Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris, who's now, in fact, the vice president-elect. Both of them, one part of their platform was that they were going to ban fracking, period. Just like that. Harris, of course, is not the president, but hopefully she'll have some influence on Joe Biden, the president-elect, insofar as he did not make that part of his platform. He is not as, I wouldn't say as radical, but he certainly wasn't endorsing the kind of climate legislation that someone like Bernie Sanders was, who endorsed the Green New Deal, which we're going to look at in this course because it's the most sweeping climate legislation ever proposed in the U.S. And even though it's not the same as the Biden climate plan, it's worth looking at. Anyhow, but think about this. Just by voting, you can put someone in office who would eliminate fracking. That 28% of emissions would be taken care of like that. So all the work that you have to do to have a plant-based diet and all that is equal just by voting. And that's pretty extraordinary. Now, is that to say that you shouldn't do personal action? Well, no, because there's still that 28% of the of methane emissions coming from the beef industry that we'd have to take care of as well. But it's just an acknowledgement that personal action is not sufficient. So you'll hear people, and we're going to see them like, dedicated climate activists like Naomi Klein or climate scientists like Michael Mann saying that personal action is good, but it's just not enough. And I'm going to echo that. It's not enough, but it is important. And another way of looking at it is you also hear the number, and we'll go over it in class, that if you look at, the lion's share of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions coming, in this planet, where are they coming from? Well, nearly 3/4 of them are coming from 100 companies. Those companies are the ones that we have to look at. So if you're an activist, I'm giving you like a shortcut to what to approach. Let's look at those 100 companies and let's reel them in. We're going to see during week 3 the current administration, and even before, in the way our government works, in the way that the fossil fuel industry is able to lobby our government. It's the case that those companies are not being reeled in now, and they really need to be. But something else to think about, it's easy to focus just on those 100 companies, but remember, they are producing products that we consume. And, that has to be remembered, that we can, in some place, we'll talk about this, the idea of sort of voting with your dollar and all. It's more complicated than that, but it is the case that we're consuming these products, and that's something that we need to take into account. But that's another issue regarding personal action that's worth noting here. And that is those corporations, and most corporations probably, would very much like to make this an issue of personal action and to focus just on that. In other words, let's go to a go-to example, which has been around, which will actually been around for a while, and we'll be looking at in this class, which is the tobacco industry. Well, for decades, the tobacco industry said, well, don't blame us. We just make a product that people want. An individual company said, if we don't make it, someone else will make tobacco because people want tobacco. That's a personal decision. If you want to solve this problem, just tell them to stop smoking. They very much say the same thing right now. If you want to solve the climate crisis, tell people to stop using it. Tell people to stop driving cars. If that's what, if that's the goal, then, why blame us? They want it. Well, as we'll see, it is considerably more complicated than that. So going back to the tobacco industry, well, for decades, that industry promoted what they were selling, which was an addictive poison, to the American public. They concealed that it was poisonous. They denied that it was poisonous, even though the science was conclusive that it was poison. And even worse, they targeted children for their ads and for distributing it. So what I mean by that is, you may know the example of the Joe Camel, which was this cartoon character that was developed to sell a brand of cigarettes called Camels. And by the 1980s, actually shortly after the campaign was introduced in the 1980s, the average 6-year-old child was more likely to recognize Joe Camel than Mickey Mouse. That's because of extraordinary advertising. And I date from an era when, when I was a teenager, anybody could buy cigarettes. In other words, there were cigarette machines outside, like of every gas station. Anyone could reach up and put the money in the slot, could buy them. And those machines had the slots low, knowing that children were going to be buying it, and there was no supervision of it. So, I remember kids when I was, 11 or 12 years old, just buying cigarettes right and left. That's a problem. That industry created the need. You can blame consumers, but it's the consumers that industry was in the business of making. And we're going to talk about that. It's kind of a radical idea. In other words, what business was the tobacco industry in? Making cigarettes and tobacco products? Yeah, but also manufacturing consumers. So let's shift over to what we're talking about. Let's talk about cars, for example. Well, cars, for my entire lifetime, every year of my lifetime, cars have been the absolute number one advertiser in the U.S. They outstrip everything else. I forget the number exactly, but I think if you look at all advertising for food products, and that would be for restaurants or things that are sold in supermarkets and all, cereal, whatever, and add all that up, the automobile industry spends well over 4 times as much money. In fact, it competes with everything else combined. It's not all that much smaller. So the automobile industry has had a huge investment in creating consumers to buy cars, and they've lobbied the government, and they sort of took over the government in some sense in the 1950s in so far as it promoted putting in incredible infrastructure in the form of roads. Eisenhower signed one act that put 41,000 miles of new highways into existence. And they've been so successful at doing it, and it's kind of staggering, because if you stand back and look at it, which we'll do in this class, well, the average American spends about 1/5 of their income on their car. That's an extraordinary amount of money. And you might say, well, yeah, but I hope to be really wealthy and make hundreds of thousands of dollars, so I don't have to spend that much money on my car. Well, yes, but all that advertising is going to encourage you that you should do that, because you can no longer have a little economy car. If you're making that sort of money, you should have a Mercedes or a Tesla, which will probably cost you, 20% of your income. At least that's the goal. But if you think about that, I mean, the argument is often made, and we're going to talk about this, well, cars give you freedom and all that. You get to drive everywhere, whenever you want. Well, what about the freedom of having a 3-day weekend for your entire life if you didn't have a car and weren't spending that money? And, what about the freedom of the fact that, cars are death traps? 50 million people die or are injured in car accidents every year. The WHO calls it an epidemic, which it is. And, the fact that it's not only healthier not to drive them, but, for every hour you spend on a bicycle, for example, you'll increase your lifespan for an hour, because it's good exercise, which cars aren't. Anyhow, you can see that industry would like to pass the buck to consumers, but we really need to look at how these industries are functioning and what they're doing and how it's impacting consumers, and in many cases, creating consumers. So that's the sort of thing we're going to be doing in this class. So you might wonder, why aren't we talking about, solar cells or new generations of lithium-ion batteries, which are good in certain ways, but we're going to be looking at the human aspect of this, not as a technological problem, but as a human problem, that whether through individual action, personal action, collective activism, or political action. And I think these are all related, by the way. So I, am not of the camp that we should just forget personal action and focus on activism. Obviously, I think activism is very important. I think personal action is very important, and we're going to talk about that. And more to the point, it's a large class, but we're not going to have the sort of individual discussions that we might in a small one. But we are going to be able to discuss this online by way of the comments that you make to the material. But beyond that, I hope to confront you with decisions, life decisions that you haven't really thought about. In other words, you might have just thought that you would get a car. Maybe you've already got a car. Maybe you couldn't wait to get a license and get a car or access to a car. But hopefully this class will maybe stop to think about that, because environmentally, forget about, how much of your income it's going to cost and their death traps and all that. But environmentally, if you're an average American, about a quarter of your carbon footprint comes from having a car. So if you want to cut your carbon footprint down, you can do it in a very simple way. If you move to a place like a city where there's good mass transit and you can bike most places. When I lived in Boston, I used to defy anyone to get anywhere faster than I could on a bicycle. So in other words, if you tried to go in a car around the city of Boston, you'd have to stop at lights where I could zip right up to the front of lights. Or if you took the subway, the T, you'd have, transfers and all. But in a bike, you can get around very quickly in a city, and no parking. It's very, very simple. So, there's a way of cutting your climate footprint down by a quarter. If you cut beef out of your life, another 15%. If you live in a responsibly sized, a smaller place, or like co-housing compared to a typical American suburban house, you're going to cut it down even more. In fact, those three things, not having a car, just cutting beef, forget about being vegan and all that, but just cutting beef and lamb out of your diet and living in a more appropriate sized dwelling, you can cut your climate footprint in half right away. So all this technology is really great, and I welcome it, but it's those sort of cultural, personal changes that we have to think about, and how to bring about a change in our culture in a big way through activism and political action. Okay, I didn't want this to be quite so long, but there you have it. That's the approach of this class. That's what we'll be doing. That's why it's being taught by a cultural historian and not a scientist or a technology person. But hopefully it'll get you thinking about it. And as I've noted, what's good about this approach is, you don't have to be a specialist in any kind of technology. These are things that anyone can do. And I'm not just talking about personal action. Look at Greta Thunberg. She's probably the most recognizable climate activist on the planet, and she started as just like any other high school student. So, anyone can do this. And, even in political action, we can obviously make appeals to politicians and all, but hey, you may not be that far away from being a politician yourself. You might scoff at the idea, but look at AOC. AOC got elected to Congress in her 20s and didn't have a lot of great, specialized background. It's not what put her there. What put her there more than anything else is she's an activist. She's an activist for, climate issues, definitely, and social justice issues and all as well. And as we'll see, those are all intertwined, and we'll see that in the class. But okay, I want to stop now, because otherwise I'm going to give you, tell you everything about the class all at one time. But hopefully it'll be fun, and hopefully it will be informative. Okay, take care.